Hi everyone. Hi Eva. I can see you. Hi. Thank you for joining everybody. My name is Prego Jeffet, and I work with the TSA. Thank you a lot for joining. I'll just be letting Gilly, hi Eva, moderate. I can see you. Before we go to that, I would like to thank you for joining everybody. Video. My name is Prego Jeffet, and I work with the TSA. Thank you a lot for joining. I'll just be letting Gilly, hi Eva, moderate. I can see you. Before we go to that, I would like to thank you for joining everybody. Video. My name is Prego Jeffet, and I work with the TSA. Thank you a lot for joining. I'll just be letting Gilly, hi Eva, moderate. I can see you. But I would like to thank you for joining everybody. My name is Prego Jeffet, and I'll just be letting Gilly, hi Eva, moderate. I can see you. But I would like to thank you. All right. Gilly, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. I would like to welcome you so that you can carry it forward.
Prego, just to be precise, did you call me Terry?
Yes, I called you. I called you, Gil.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Great to have everyone on board today, and welcome to this very, very important pre-hackathon event co-created by TSA and I for Policy. I think one of the things that it's very important to mention quite early on is, as much as technology and innovation and everything else is important to what we do, something that is equally important is the engagement that we ought to have around it. If you have quite good innovation and you don't have a good enabling environment, you don't have good enough policies, things don't happen. People think that it is the US or China or a couple of other countries that have the best innovation in the world. The reality is innovation is almost in every other country, but it flourishes in few countries that create the policy environment that allows it to sustain itself and grow. So welcome, because this is very, very important, and it has certainly to be an integral part of the conversation. Before we start, I would like to welcome Zahoro. I hope he's part of us for some, opening remarks, just 2 or 3 minutes as to why we're here. And then after that, I'll connect to Jumanne, who is also a very important partner to this whole process. And then we'll kick it in into the next phase where we'll get into the crux of the discussions. So thank you very much for all of you who have been able to join us today, and for the awesome panel across the continent that have agreed to be with us here today. Thank you very much. So Zahoro, are you around? I see Zahoro is not here. So let me just bridge over to you, Jumanne, straight away.
Great, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Great. Yeah, so thank you so much, guys. I'm super excited to have this conversation. It's something that we've been having for a couple of times in Tanzania, trying to understand how can we have conducive environment for our startup. I really appreciate John from iPolicy. You're doing amazing work across the continent, pushing this agenda. I'm happy also this is part of the Global Entrepreneurship Week, and I'm also very happy that this is being organized by TSA, being a founding and a board member, but also I'm very excited. We are also strategically involved in this as Sahara Venture, Sahara Sparks, part of the Africa Beyond 2020. So jumping to what exactly I want to share with you, I would love to do like a 5 slides presentation of what I prepared for you guys. And basically is just to spark the conversation, because I know this is more of a learning and experience sharing session. Yeah, so as you already know, we kind of understand what is happening in other countries, like Tunisia, Senegal, and now Kenya and Ghana. You are all in one way or the other riding this transformational change in terms of trying to see what can be done in creating this conducive environment in Africa for businesses. And Tanzania, we're kind of that last joining the bus, trying to understand where we're going, you've been able to encounter and how you have been, is the overall understanding in terms of the difference between and SMEs. Sorry, can you guys hear me? Ali, can you hear me?
Your network is not that smooth. Maybe your stability is not good. It goes on and off, but you still manage, okay?
Let me change the connection. 1 minute. Okay.
So while Jumanne is doing his technical part of things, I'll just interject for a few minutes also to just give you a bit of a brief of who has joined us in our panel today. So apart from colleagues who are with us here in Tanzania, Zahoro, Jumanne, we are joined with a colleague from Ghana and Justice, and we would really expect to hear how is the framework of policy environment in Ghana and how that's working for the startups in that part of West Africa. But we also have our colleague Eva from Senegal. Fantastic place, lovely country. So we hope to hear some a bit of Francophone here today. We have a colleague Ali from Tunisia. We understand that Tunisia is a country being reborn as we speak, and it will be quite interesting to hear, how the new government is supporting the process of enabling startups in Tunisia. We also have a colleague, Victor, from Kenya, and John from Rwanda. John will have a time to wrap up our discussion today, and we really hope to hear his expertise from the organization that he's leading and some of the fantastic things that we know Rwanda is doing. So we are in for a good treat today, and I'm really happy that all of you are joining us here today. So buckle up and you're in for a good ride. In the meantime, Jumanne, are you back?
Are we good? Can you guys hear me? I've changed the internet connection.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay,
so please
great. Let me just get into it. So I was saying that one of the challenges we are facing right now as a country is this overall understanding between the difference between SMEs and startup. Most of our policies and regulation were primarily designed for SMEs, And now we're trying to advise the government to move from just traditional thinking of how SMEs operate and try to get a bit of understanding on startup. So this had massive impact in terms of how public and private funds operate, in terms of how business were being formalized in Tanzania, also in terms of market incentives that the government has been designing. So everything that was primarily designed was not designed for startups. For example, the funds that currently available that are being given out by the local government authority are actually given to groups of youth. So they don't recognize something called founders. What they recognize is group of founders. Young people between 10 to 15 can go and ask for that money, but not as individuals. So those are some of the challenges that we have been facing as a country. And the biggest problem has been also all these crucial component of making sure we have that conducive policy. They are working in silos. So innovators and startups are working in their own group. Ecosystem regulators, they are working in their own group. Ecosystem financiers are working on their own group, as well as ecosystem enablers. So as TSA, what we are trying to achieve was, can we bring all these players together to have this kind of conversation on how we can be able to move forward and create that conducive environment for startups. If you talk to startups today, they will tell you, we really want the environment to be improved, but we don't have time for the politics. If you talk to regulators, they say we are doing our level best to make sure small businesses have access to good business environment, but their definition of small businesses is traditional small businesses. And if you talk to ecosystem and enablers, they also want to see startups operating in a conducive environment, but they don't know how to approach it. And for the financiers, the frustration is even high because sometimes they have money, but they cannot finance because the legal and regulatory frameworks doesn't allow them to do that. So we go back to the Africa startup policy conundrum, where those who design the policies for startups, they don't understand about startup, and those who work with startup don't understand policies and regulation, and they don't have time and resources. And this is one of the challenges that we are also facing in Tanzania. Maybe some of you guys, because you've passed through this stage, you can advise us on how to approach it. And finally, one of the challenges that we see happening, and you guys can help us to explain, if you talk about this thing of startup policy, everybody talks about capacity building, capacity building, capacity building. What we feel is that we need to jump beyond capacity building to understand what are the really like core issues, why this thing is not working in some countries. And again, without forgetting that every country, they have their own regulations and policies and structures, and the importance of co-creation. And that is another area. We want to know how were you able to achieve those co-creation setup in terms of gathering 360 feedback and reviews from different colleagues within your team. And if it is possible to establish those policy sandboxes, and if you are able to establish those policy sandboxes within your own countries, how did you do it, and what would we advise to Tanzania in order for us to reach that stage where we can have what we call a user-centered policy, where everyone can be involved in designing policy for startup and not just people who are strategically located in the decision-making position. So again, as I said, my role was just to kickstart and ignite the conversation. You are as the experts here based on other countries, and Tanzania, as I say, we're just getting into this boat, and we're really looking for your thank you so much, and we are to you.
Thank you very much, Jumanne, for that quite a good intro, a good starter. So let's get right into it. Let's get into the crux of the matter. The enabling ecosystem. Do we have a good environment that encourages, startup in the country. So Justice, Eva, Ali, Victor, let me just give you 1 minute each. Let's start with you, Justice. Just 1 minute of introduction. Who are you, what you do, and then we'll start with the first round of questions. So Justice, then we're gonna go Eva, we're gonna go Ali, then we're gonna go Victor.
Okay, thank you for having me. I really appreciate this. And I actually represent African Entrepreneurship Dialogue. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can hear me, right?
Your voice is a bit on a downside. I'm not sure if you can speak much louder.
Is it better now?
Way better. Thank you.
Is it better?
Much.
Can you hear me?
Much
Is it better? Yeah, so I'm the Executive Director of African Entrepreneurship Dialogue. Way back in 2017, we ran a diagnosis on the startup ecosystem in Ghana. And we realized that Ghana has a fragmented policy that seems to not be focusing in supporting and reinvigorating job creation through startups. And we decided to find out what is the best way we can propose within the stakeholder ecosystem. And then we came out that there is a need for us to have a legal framework that actually accept these imports of policies at a one-shop platform. So the only option that came in mind, the only solution that came in mind was a startup act. So we have to dig deeper, and we realized that Tunisians have started that, and they just enacted it a few years ago. And whatever we're doing right now, I believe that the power, the encouragement, the reinvigoration spirit, credit must be given to Tunisia. They actually show boldness, they show the firmness, and we are following their footsteps. But nonetheless, so we launched an advocacy, an official advocacy, and telling government, telling the stakeholders that the Startup Act needs to be focused. We need a legal framework. And we believe that a Startup Act is the way to go. So 2 years ahead, within 2 years, government entities were interested. As I'm talking to you right now, government, which is the Ministry of Development, Development Services, actually accepted that this is the way to go. They have just few months to election. So they've actually mobilized some funds. We are at a conference retreat now, working on the zero draft. So we don't know how it's going to happen after election. But the point that I'm making is that, yes, a group of people decided to strongly advocate for an act. Some group of people also came out and said, this is the way to go. So there was a joint effort to push the government to understand that this is the way to go. Fortunately, we've gotten a minister who wants to support. So we are working on the draft. So we have NEIP, the Ministry of Development Service, who is helping us to do that. And as I said,
so Justice, just to give you a bit of a pause. We will come back to the details of it all in the series of questions that we have. Yeah, great. So Ali, I mean, what do you do? And then Eva, what do you do? And then we'll come back to those questions on details of it.
Thank you, Gilad, and thanks everyone for the kind invitation. I'm Ali Mnif. I'm from Tunisia. I've been working, of course, as a volunteer in the first task force that was formed back in 2016, working on drafting a set of recommendations that would constitute what we have today, what we call today a Startup Act. We started working back in February 2016, and we continued the work until April 2018. In April 2018, the Parliament voted the Startup Act, and we took 1 year, and the task force continued working on enforcing the law, because it's very important, and probably something that I would emphasize later on. There is the law and there is the enforcement of the law, and the enforcement of the law is as important, if not more important, than the legal framework itself. And we know that what kind of leaks that could happen between a very beautiful legislative design and how this design and how these set of laws are ruled on the ground. So it's a very important. So in April 2018, we voted the law in the Parliament. In April 2019, we started issuing or labeling startups. And since April 2019 till today, more than 340 startups received their label in Tunisia. And I'm sitting also in the Collège des Startups, which is an entity that provides to which startups are pitching, and that provides or give that label that would give or provide startups with a set of incentives that I can cover later on. But my full-time job, this is not my full-time job, of course. I'm doing this, as I told you, voluntarily. But my full-time job, I have a consultancy, like I think Juman in the beginning. The Sahara consultancy, some sort of consultancy, and we work on entrepreneurship. So we have digital solutions. We do mapping of ecosystems, and we cover North Africa and some sub-Saharan African countries.
So when I come back to you again, Ali, the first question I will ask you is I want to know what you mean by startups. When Tunisia says that this is about startup, what are you talking about? Eva, are you with us? I'd want just a quick introduction from you. What do you do?
Thank you so much. And hi, everybody. Very happy to be here and very excited to see this new process in Tanzania. So my name is Eva Sowebian. I'm based in Dakar, Senegal. I'm the director of community of IFO Policy. So a movement of 220 hubs covering 48 countries on the continent. And what we believe in is convening ecosystem leaders to really co-create policy reforms and make sure that we have an inclusive approach on policy making processes. So at IFO Policy, of course, we have several pillars of activities. We are conducting a lot of policy reforms, actually under 19 countries on the continent, but also bringing to our communities technologies as well as methodology and civic tools to be able to include their community, to include the civil society, and foster collective action as well as reform processes that will change meaningfully, the life of our communities and the growth of the startups.
Eva, that was a precise, eloquent introduction. So I will come back to you with a question on the structure of engagement. I want to know how that works in Senegal. I mean, when you say that you're trying to troubleshoot what's in the economy, what does that mean? I mean, where do you start? Where does it end? And what's the outcome of it? Victor, are you with us, please?
Yeah, my name
Tell us a little bit about yourself, Victor.
Yeah, so my name is Victor Otieno. I am the managing director of an SME and startup research and consultancy based here in Nairobi, Kenya. So our focus basically is, of course, doing research at both farm level, ecosystem level, as well as research that helps to drive policy. Of course, with a focus on Kenya. I also I'm the immediate former policy advisor to the Association of Startup and SME Enablers of Kenya, which is very similar to what you have in Tanzania. So of course, I also sit because the Kenyan Startup Bill is in play. So we are still in the process of going through readings in Parliament. I also chair the technical committee that is is drafting that and is just engaging the public around the Startup Bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victor. I will also come back to you trying to understand more of the structure of the startups in Kenya. I mean, you guys are quite close to where we are, and I'm trying to think that maybe our ecosystems could be more or less similar. So let's start with you, Ali, then I'll go to Justice. Ali, what does it mean to be a startup in your country? I mean, in sometimes when you read these things, you kind of wonder, okay, why would you have a startup policy while you already have a business registration policy, which perhaps every business is a startup? I mean,
sorry, Jalil, before answering your question,
where did it come from? I mean,
well, how much time do I have so I can think of a very concise?
Let's start with 5. If we need, then I'll give you 2 more minutes.
So before going to the definition of a startup, because the first article of the Startup Act is a definition of a startup. However, it's very hard to define legally right? What's a startup? Because a startup is temporary, right? A startup ceases to be a startup when they go to IPO, when they got acquired. So it's a temporary structure. How can we define a temporary structure in a law, right? That's number one. But before going to the Startup Act, how did we come up with the Startup Act idea? I mean, it started with a vision called Startup Tunisia, where we try to identify the different bottlenecks for startups in the country. And the first bottleneck is a legal framework, lack of legal framework in the country, not only for startups, entrepreneurs, and investors. And these are the three target audiences of the Startup Act. So the Startup Act is not only for startups, it's for startups, entrepreneurs, and investors. That's the first bottleneck. The second bottleneck we identified is a lack of support, organizations, and financial investors. Has been identified after a large consultation, and that's why I present myself as being part of that task force. I mean, there is no hierarchy there. We are all working towards the same objective, and we try to collect and to work in some sort of a collective intelligence, right? So second bottleneck is the lack of support and financial organizations. And the third one we identified is how to open up markets. You know, when you work with DFIs, and I think it's very common in Africa because most of our initiatives are funded through international financial institutions. And these institutions are mostly focused on creating jobs because of the pressing issues our countries are facing in terms of demand in the job market, etc. And I think this is truly probably one of the differences between SMEs and startups. Startups are about creating markets, not about creating jobs. So we have to shift from job creating entrepreneurship to market creating entrepreneurship. And that shift is very important to happen not only in the mindset of entrepreneurs, but also investors, policymakers, and financial institutions, because at the end of the day, we work closely with them. Back to your question, how did we define what's a startup? We basically said, let's make it the simplest possible. We saw examples of how Italians, Irish, India defined their startups, and I would say, found a middle ground, right? So we have 5 criteria. 3 are objective, 2 are subjective. The 3 objective criteria are a Tunisian company by law that has less than 8 years of experience, of existence, 8 years. The second is the total cash flow or total operations turnover of the company should not exceed 5 million euros, the equivalent of 5 million euros. And the structure of the capital has to be independent, not to make sure that there is no former SMEs that want to take advantage of that law would spin off into a startup to take advantage of it. So we made sure that the structure of the capital must remain independent. These are the 3 objective criteria, eligibility criteria. The 2 remaining subjective criteria are innovation and scalability. Now, it's very tricky. Like for the first 3 criteria, it's binary, right? It's 0 or 1, whether you have less 8 years of existence or not, whether you have less than 15 million dinars or 5 million euros of turnover or not. Right? It's mechanic in the way it's processed. However, for innovation and scalability, it's not the case, and it's tricky. So we open 2 corridors, right, to assess that. First corridor, which is the main one, is it's not to the government to say if the startup is innovative or scalable. It's to the market and back to the market-driven entrepreneurship. So if a startup succeeds into raising funds from an investment fund, that success, that fundraising, it's in itself is sufficient to say that the startup is innovative and scalable, right? So the market decides if the startup is innovative and scalable. However, today in Tunisia, back to the second bottleneck we identified, lack of support and financial institutions or organizations, we don't have enough investment funds. So we had to create a new corridor, an exceptional corridor, until we have sufficient or enough investment funds in the country, right? And that's what we are working on right now, which is a fund of fund to multiply the number of investment funds in the country. So as I told you, the first or the main corridor is a decision by the market. If the startup succeeds into raising funds, it's enough to say the startup is innovative and scalable. If the startups actually has the rest of the objective criteria, they got their label. Now, the second corridor is we put in place a Collège des Startups, right? So we're a team of 9 people, representative of the private sector, the public sector, and independent evaluators, chosen by the chief of government. And we have a mandate of 3 years, non-renewable. And we actually process on a monthly basis between 30 and 50 startup applications, where we have to decide on that 2 criteria only. Sorry, I got I mean, I don't know if you have a question or.
No, just please go ahead, and I'll just try to remind every other participant to mute their mic, and if there's anyone with any question, they should just put that in the chat box. Please go ahead, Ali.
So these are the 5 criteria. The 3 first criteria are objective, automatically treated on the platform we created for that purpose, which is startupact.tn. And then the 2 other criteria, until we have multiple investment funds which will decide on these 2 criteria, we put in place Collège des Startups, which decide for now on these 2 criteria. And as I told you, I mean, it's been now more than 1 year, and we're you know, processing every month between 30 and 50 startup applications.
So I really appreciate that very elaborate background, and I think it sets the stage for everyone in every other country that, you know, this is not about every other company that's getting started. This is about, you know, very specific set of companies in tech, and not everyone would, you know, qualify as startup, but rather those in that particular space. So I'll come back to you, Justice, now with the follow-up. I mean, is that the same kind of blueprint that you're following up in Ghana? Is that the case?
Can you hear me?
You can also hold on to your mic close to your mouth so that we can hear you much closer.
Let me just do that.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Is it better now? It's better now, right? Great. As Ali said, Ghana, we are still at the 0 draft, right? We are still at the 0 draft. And one of the challenge is getting a definition that will be legally accepted in Ghana for the startup. It has been very tough. Before walking into this conference, we are actually still deliberating the definition of startup in Ghana. But look, there are 2 schools of thought when you want to consider the definition of startup in your country. For Tunisians, they have theirs. For Italians, they have theirs. And they have actually been selective. They've chosen the selective one. It means that the Startup Act label is not for everybody. It's not for every startup. It's for innovative startup that are tech enabled. Now in Ghana, AFED is proposing a liberation momentum, a definition that will swallow every startup in Ghana. Right. There is another school of thought that for us to be very competitive, we need to actually go in for the selective option, where we need to encourage startups to be innovative and disruptors, to be very competitive in the global market. So we are looking for Ghana. Our objective is still not clear. We have 2 minimal options that we are discussing, and I4Policy in Ghana is part of the discussion as well. So now we are looking at this thematic area. The reason why we are having a challenge is that in Ghana, we have an SME policy that actually defined what a small, micro, medium business is. And then we have a pending act, Enterprise Act, that is about to be enacted. So we don't want our startup definition to be a repetition of what is captured in the Enterprise Act and the SME policy. So we want to have a very comprehensive definition that will be accepted. So we are looking at whether the startups that we're going to issue labels should be innovative, that is driven by technology. That is another topic of discussion we are having. Other people, other group of people within the stakeholder conference we are having that open it up, don't make it tech enabled, because it actually eliminates a lot of people. Others are also saying that we should, if you want the country to be very competitive in the global market, we should come out with innovators and disruptors that can actually compete and maximize gain for the country. So we are still about it, but we are looking at the turnover, the assets of the company, and then we are looking about innovation. Being innovative doesn't necessarily mean that you are tech enabled. So we are looking, innovative businesses are going to be accepted as one of the definition, thematic areas of the definition. Yeah, so what I want to say in short is that we are 90% close to getting a definition for the Ghana ecosystem when it comes to the startup definition. Okay, so that's what I would say.
Thank you very much for that. So we move to the Francophone, Senegal. So I mentioned this, Eva, earlier on, that I will come back to you with the structure of engagement. So now that we know, these are the criteria, these are the kind of startups that we want, the political environment, how does it take it? I mean, is it easy to talk with government there? How did you guys do it? How did you kickstart that conversation? Where did you go? Where did it take you? So over to you, Eva.
Thank you so much. I think that's a very interesting question, because usually the ecosystem has the feeling that it's quite hard to be able to link with the government and to be able to co-create with them. I need to say that in Senegal, it was a very inclusive process where we had the entrepreneurial ecosystem, as well as many stakeholders from the government, but also the World Bank. And we really take advantage of two momentum that was happening. I hope that you can hear me. Thank you, Victor. So two momentum that was happening. The first was that the government was really volunteering at that moment to understand what was the startup ecosystem and how they could be including the startup into the local economy development. And that was one of an assessment that the government and mainly the president itself did in front of the ecosystem, bringing all the hubs, bringing the entrepreneurs together to discuss about different promises that he wanted to make for the ecosystem. And of course, it was related to capacity building, as you mentioned, funding, as it came also, but also the regulatory framework that needed to change. The second momentum was the fact that we had the World Bank that was about to do a new loan to the government of Senegal, and the World Bank engaged with us into this process to be able to make sure that the startup act will be one of the conditions to attribute the loans to the government of Senegal. So regarding to that, we came up with a methodology that we're using at IFO Policy for this reform process at national level, which is the innovation for policy process. It is a very iterative methodology that we have developed, which has three main steps. The first, it's what we call the agenda setting, and it's really the critical phases where we will build this coalition of ecosystem leaders, where we will build this coalition with the government and make sure that we all came up with a common objective and a common agenda in regard to the process. So it was really interesting because the ecosystem in Dakar was really looking at having synergies and collaboration, and also in joint with the government to understand what was possible at that moment and bringing solutions that we could put in the table. So it came with a lot of understanding. So how can we better dialogue between the government and between the ecosystem leaders? How also can we make sure that we all targeting the same agenda? And at the end, it's really about co-creating and understanding that through this co-creation process, it was important to take each stakeholders in regard to their dedicated mandate, but also what they could have as an advantage in working with the startups ecosystem. While we have been going into these agenda setting phases, we also understand that it was quite important to make sure that we were enough inclusive, in the sense that, and I think that Ali points that out, we were targeting different level of startup at a different stage of development, whether there was at ideation phase, whether they was really doing research of their business model, whether there was at the growth phase, but also make sure that we will include students, for instance, which will be the next generation of entrepreneurs, and champions from the government. And it's really those champions, those public champions from the government, that really help us to gather more institution from the government, as well as giving us a strength of influence by putting us in contact with the office of the presidency. And through this process, we even had the chance to be able to do a direct advocacy to the president itself. So I will emphasize more for the moment on the agenda setting, which is really for me, how do we build this strong private-public coalition, and that will definitely define what will be all the activities and how the government will really involve themselves into the different co-creation activities for the whole process. And then just as an information, and I think we will have the chance to discuss further about this, the two other stages are the drafting phase. In Senegal, for instance, we had near to 50 co-creation activities with the government and with the ecosystem. We had 20 iterations of the startup law itself. And the last phase is the implementation phase, where it is all about how do we operationalize the law, as well as how do we evaluate it. I hope that it answered your question.
I mean, that was very, very eloquent and very, very elaborate, and I really appreciate it. I mean, I will come back to you and ask you a question about a success story that you know, in your engagements that you have had, and I would like to hear something about that, because you know, the engagements between the politicians and, you know, the policymakers and companies is quite vital. So over to you, Victor. What is the structure of the engagements in Nairobi? You know, that creates an enabling environment for the ecosystem. What's happening there?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think for us, the thrust of having the startup bill is varied, in the sense that we have a government, for instance, that you know, had estimated to, you know, create some certain number of jobs in the economy. And this is, of course, majorly was to be driven by the, you know, your traditional SMEs. So that has not been happening. We should, you know, according to World Bank, for example, in Kenya, we should be, you know, we are getting around 900,000 new entrants into the job market. And SMEs are not, as much as in they are, you know, creating employment, they're not meeting these numbers. So of course, startups becomes an avenue for, you know, job creation. So that's one thrust, or one area where we got, you know, some thrust around the bill. Number two is if you look at the performance of Kenyan startups, despite the lack of a law, is Kenyan startups have been doing very well. So I think if you reference Partech 2019 report, we had around 17% of all venture capital coming into Africa going to Kenyan startups. So of course, it means that Kenyan startups are doing something right, despite not having any kind of support from government. So our process, of course, started in 2019 October, when you know, the Senator for Nairobi convened a meeting with I think over 20 stakeholders to have conversations around you know, what can we do to support startups in Kenya. And of course, we've had the same conversations, iterations around a legislative proposal for the last 1 year, which culminated in you know, a bill being published in September, Of course, that's still a draft because it has to go through Parliament. And of course, we through that process, we've continued to have engagements. So the structure of the startup bill in Kenya has been around anchoring the development of startups through incubation hubs. So previously, what we've seen is a lot of startups have been able to fundraise and succeed without having to go through an incubation hub. But if you are to create a significant number of pipeline, because a lot of investors are also not investing in pre-revenue kind of startups, and a lot of startups are still not hitting those turnover numbers that can really entice investors. So for you to be able to create enough pipeline of these startups, it means that we had to decentralize that process to go to our county. So Kenya, we have two levels of government. We have the national government and we have the county governments. So what we anchored the startup bill on incubators within the counties. So either the county government can create an incubation hub from scratch as an affirmative action because of market forces of demand and supply, you might not get an incubation hub in the marginalized areas of the country. So in instances where there are no existing hubs, a government can establish a hub in that area. Yeah, so that we can be able to get those ideas and really decentralize innovation to at the very micro, at the village level. And in instances where there's a hub, the bill gives a provision for the private hub to collaborate with government, so that the government does not have to reinvent the wheel. And based on that structure, then you realize, or we hope that we'll get a lot of startups at the village level, creating different kind of products and services to and offering solving challenges at that level, and possibly create enough traction or enough number of or create a good pipeline of startups that we can be able to attract significant investment into the country. So far, we've seen even despite the bill being in Senate, being debated, is we've already seen one county already set up an incubation hub. It's called Makueni County, which is very encouraging for us. And in terms of participation, of course, we worked with John of I4Policy in our public participation. We've had so far over 200 different organizations across the country giving their input. And the challenges that we still have, maybe for example, around registration. I think borrowed a bit from Tunisia, where we are trying to have a special label for both startups and incubators. We are still discussing how and the mechanism or the framework for incentives. So these are issues to do with intellectual property, issues to do with the credit guarantee scheme, as well as grants. So that's where the situation is in Kenya. We are hoping that maybe by first quarter of 2021, we should have our final act in place.
Thank you very much. Victor. And I think that was quite elaborate. So what I'm gathering is that there is one country that has gone quite ahead, and it's becoming quite exemplary when it comes to startup policies. And I think a lot of other countries are pivoting from that example, are trying to see how they can sort of cascade that into their own context and make it work, which I think is quite a fantastic and a very African thing to do. Now, I want to go back to Ali, and then I'll rotate back to all panelists. How do you measure success? I mean, you have been operating this for a year. Is it working? I mean, what are your metrics? I mean, is it just the amount of companies that get startup accreditation? Is it the amount of fund that gets invested? What tells you that we have we have a successful policy in our country?
Depending on who's asking the question. As I mentioned earlier, if you ask a donor, their questions would be, how many jobs did you create, right? If you ask me, I mean, what I want to see is a movement, is a momentum, right? Number of startups is very important to me, right? Because it's, at the end of the day, entrepreneurship is about inspiration. When we see Facebook and Google and Tesla, etc., it's the kind of inspiration we want to see. I mean, it inspires a lot of youth in Tunisia and across Africa. So it's for me the most important part of it. And when I see events and webinars like this one, and I had the pleasure also to be with Justice earlier this year with the Ghanaian task force. I think this is the kind of movement that inspires entrepreneurs, but policymakers, investors, etc. So for me, success is a very relative, I would say, concept. Now, back to your question, I think you want a more precise answer. I understand that. Number one, as I told you, the number of startups. Number two, and it was mentioned by my Kenyan colleague, it's not only working with entrepreneurs. You're also working with support organizations. You're also working with investors. And we need to support these people as well, because at the end of the day, their mission is to produce investment-ready startups, or to produce, I would say, scalable startups. So as we created the label for startups, we are also putting in place different mechanisms to support the startups at different stages of their development. So we have, for instance, when the startup obtains the label, they get what we call a reimbursable grant. And also in the bridge stage between the seed and the Series A, we also provide a reimbursable grant, right? We also provide grants for support organizations that want to open up to a new market or to a new region. Say a university want to set up an accelerator. We are able to provide that university with the grant resources for them to open an accelerator. Say a company like an existing traditional SME wants to have an R&D center with a startup lab or a startup studio. This is also possible to get funded. And the last one is for accelerator that are able to produce labeled startup. So for an accelerator or an incubator, each time that accelerator or incubator is producing startups which are receiving the startup label, they get rewarded, right? And it created that virtuous cycle or circle in which everyone is, encouraged to produce the kind of startups we want to see. However, I mean, these are all, nice things to say. We have a lot of things that we need. First, we have a very small market. We are not Egypt, we're not Nigeria, we're not South Africa, we're a 10 million people country. Our market is, insignificant for startups to scale up. So we need to equip our startups to be more aggressive when they try to, position themselves in new markets. Two, and that's why the Startup Act came up. We are a former French colony, and I think my colleague from Senegal would echo that. We inherited one of the worst legal framework globally, right? Very complicated, very bureaucratic, no common law, etc. So that's why we needed to open a new corridor, right? And we called it the Startup Act. If you go to Mauritius, for instance, they don't need a Startup Act because their legal framework for SMEs is as welcoming for SMEs than for startups, right? And unfortunately, we inherited that, right? Number three, so first, our market, second, our legal framework, and three, our currency, right? Our currency is devalorized and unconvertible, and we are fighting. We gave startups, one of the incentives we provided for startups is the ability to detain a free currency bank account in which they can receive foreign currency and they can send foreign currency as much as they want without prior authorization of the central bank. So, I mean, I don't want to just depict a nice picture of what we have done so far. We're still struggling. It's a good step that we made, but we still have a long way ahead. And I think this kind of meetings is only to get inspired, back to the inspiration that I mentioned, but also probably that could be also interesting is to create that bridges between our ecosystem and yours, As I mentioned earlier, the friendship that I cultivated with Justice, I hope that it's gonna translate into a more permanent bridge between Tunisia and Ghana, same way between Tunisia and Tanzania. And yeah, let's keep that conversations going.
Thank you very much, Ali. So over to you, Justice, and then Eva, and then back to Victor. What do you consider success in your country? I mean, this whole startup thing, is it about jobs? Is it about, getting, the next Tesla to come from Ghana or the next Uber to come from Senegal?
Yeah, the fundamental or the rudiment to answer this question is your objective. What objective is your startup act seeking to do? Then you can measure success, right? As Ali said, I mean, the perspective of success varies, right? But we in Ghana, as I said, we are focusing on job creation. Job security is an issue in Ghana and probably in Africa. The second one has to do with how can we also produce the next generation that can also compete in the global market to become the next Facebook founder, Amazon, and those kind of stuff. We cannot be proud. I haven't seen an African whose businesses has traveled so long through innovation as I can see with Amazon. I can see with Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram and stuff. So we are looking at job security. So at the end of the day, we expect the product that will actually graduate through the Startup Act be able to generate a lot of jobs. So people will be encouraged to start their own business without fear, right? So, and then, as I said, a liberation momentum. We want to see a lot of entrepreneurial activity. In Ghana, our economy is more informal. In the informal sector, there are a lot of small businesses that doesn't have an identity. So investment even becomes a problem. Government trying to identify and taxing them become a problem. So we are looking at job creation. We are looking at the end of this 8 years, government can identify these number of startups within the informal sector that used not to be taxed, to be identified and taxed. Now, the other thing have to do with the competitiveness. Okay, how can we not just produce startups, but we are producing startups that have disruptive solutions that can actually compete on the global market? That is our major focus. So these fundamentals are what the government want to hear. Is the startup going to generate a lot of jobs? Is the startup going to actually help them maximize revenue? Yes, it's going to do that. Once you exited from the startup stage, you are already identified and government is going to tax you because you've gotten a benefit for 8 years. Yes, these startups have the potential to create jobs, but what we are most importantly want to see, we want to raise the next giants of entrepreneurs from Africa, should come from Ghana, disruptors, innovators that can actually compete globally. And that is what our focus should be on, right? So that is what I would say for now.
Thank you very much, Justice. Eva, over to you.
So I just want, before getting into your question, to just jump quickly on what Justice was saying, because I think that that's quite similar to the case here in Senegal, the fact that we were really looking at how can we leverage employability and of course job creation, as well as understanding how we could really provide access to key information for those early age startups, for them to be able to be formalized in such a simplest process, as well as understanding that we are putting the different incentive for them to grow and for tomorrow to be getting into the government taxation strategy. So it was different a component of it. The other part that was also important is, if we're looking at startups that we want to scale, how do we make sure that they have access to the right capacity building? Capacity building, of course, through education, as well as through the different partners. Hali mentioned the hubs, and even in the Senegal startup law, you will find that there is an incentive part that is dedicated to the ecosystem support organization for them to be able to provide those capacity to the startup, as well as being bridges to register the startups and to labelize them. So this is the similarities that I wanted to bring up. Coming back to the process itself, I need to say that it was quite important to mention the fact that we came up with different intervention. Of course, the process in Senegal started with the Dakar Policy Hackathon. So we organized a policy hackathon, and that was through this policy hackathon that we get a challenge mapping of all the needs and the main challenges that those startups was facing. And from those challenges, we came up with solution, and those solution was translating into law. So I see that there is even a question from Prudence in the chat that is asking if there is a successful draft we have been turned into law. For all the processes that we have been running, we always draft a document with the ecosystem leaders themselves based on the solution that we hear from the entrepreneur of that ecosystem. And it's through this co-creation process, therefore, with the government, with some legal firms, that we will consolidate this draft into a law, and it will get its process. I need also to say that in Senegal, the process was quite quick. I mean, it took us 19 months to go from the policy hackathon to the vote of the startup at the National Assembly. But it also translates the fact that we really have a dedication and an involvement of the public stakeholders into the whole process. We even settled a steering committee. In that steering committee, we had the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Digital Economy, as well as the Ministry of Higher Education, of Work, the SMEs Agency, even if we are targeting startup more specifically, together with the taxation office, the custom office, and the regulator. So it was really understanding which role each of them needs to play, and how can we make sure that they all came up on the same momentum and agenda to define what is the incentive and what role there will be in putting those incentives for the different startups. The second point after the intervention is that we really learned that it was quite important to come up with some case studies. So during the co-creation session, and mainly during those sessions with the government, we bring on some startups from the ecosystem, and we will bring out some of the numbers to really show what is the advantage if this incentive will put it in place. So we will have one that was really targeting, for instance, about the taxation. So came up with an example of amount they have been fundraising, and on that amount, how much they needed to pay to the taxation office. We will come with another one that will highlight the fact that in creating jobs and what is the amount of taxes he's paying for his employees, for instance. We will have another one, which is, for instance, doing some local transformation product and selling that through a platform, or at the inverse, if there is one startup that was doing or building software or hardware products, and how much it will have to pay as tax to be able to bring the electronic component in Senegal, or how much it needs to pay to the custom if you want to export its products in the other country. So the case study was really important because it was giving tangible and concrete example of what was going on. And the third point that I wanted to highlight through this process is the fact that we didn't from the beginning say that, okay, we came up with a draft. This draft was co-created with the ecosystem leaders. We had a few intervention focus group, the hackathons that brings the entrepreneur, and the government was involved. So we are happy with the law that we wanted. We really wanted the law to be as inclusive as possible. And we bring innovation in the way to outreach to most communities through a chatbot and a web platform. So we did a public consultation of these documents with a forum where the entrepreneur could really challenge themselves in regards to the solution that was proposing, as well as a chatbot on social media to really meet the social entrepreneur, to meet the diaspora entrepreneur that wanted to come back or invest in Senegal, as well as to include the entrepreneur that was on the other part of the region. And I think this is very critical if we want tomorrow to come up with a law that will affect all the startups. And it came back to your first question of what a startup is. And I think it's quite important, because one of the key learnings that we see in working with the IFO policy communities and rolling out this different process in several countries is that this definition can be quite different depending on the market. And the market really drives what do we see as a startup and what is therefore the incentive and the regulatory framework that is needed to affect them positively and to push for their growth. And I will finish with coming back on another question, which is, what is the normal cycle of a policy reform process? I think that there is no defined cycle. I mean, for us, it took 19 months. Comparing to the vote of the Startup Act in Mali, for instance, it was 6 months, so it was quite quick. We started the process in November in DRC, and the law is about to go at any time to the Minister Council, but it took a year, so 12 months. So I think it's really depend on the momentum of the ecosystem. It depends on the involvement and the understanding of the public stakeholder and how do they decide to work together through the government and then in a coalition with the entrepreneurs. And yeah, so we cannot define that cycle, but I just believe that even if it needs and it's become to be long, it's important to just make sure that it's enough inclusive and enough iterative.
That's fantastic, and I think that's a wonderful point to leave it at. Victor, over to you. I mean, what is success on your side, and in terms of engagement and the policy framework? How are you guys finding it there?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I think the startup bill comes at an intersection where the country had already made its long-term strategic plan, and this is in Kenya. It's captured under what is called the Vision 2030. So of course, the Vision 2030 was aligned to SDGs, etc. And one of the critical areas was around job creation, which is a major problem for a lot of African countries. So I think based on that, what the challenge that we had is the government of the day has four priority areas, which we are calling the Big Four agenda, which is prioritizing manufacturing, food, health, etc. And so the challenge for us, at least at a policy level, was to try to convince government that the startup bill or the startup policy will be able to help further the agenda or the strategy that is already in place. So of course, the conversation has not been easy. We are still, of course, our process is still ongoing. We are hoping that it should be done by first quarter of 2021. But I think in terms of success, what I see is from us, I think from where I sit and looking at government priorities, is I feel that if we, as the startup policy or the helping startups should be able to help the country create more jobs. Because at the end of the day, that is the reality that your usual citizen or your typical Kenyan is expecting. If we are not creating jobs, then we are making noise. So one of the things we are really trying to do is to ensure that startups have enough incentives, of course, plus together with the different stakeholders, which I mentioned, incubators as well as investors. We should be able to reach a point where we have a critical number of startups that are fundraising and are really thriving and are able to create jobs either directly or indirectly. And we've already seen like Figure Foods is a great example of a startup that has fundraised and is creating jobs of, is handling around over 30,000 different individuals on their platforms, which is basically what we intend or we hope to see as an output, an actual output out of implementing this startup bill. So I think for me that's really the bottom line, because if we don't align with government and government priorities, then even if you are to have the bill in place, implementing it is going to be a challenge, because the people who actually are going to implement it are actually government officials. And if they're not convinced that this is part of their KPIs, then we might see a challenge. So for me, bottom line is job creation, being able to attract more foreign direct investments or venture capital in the country, of course, and placing Kenya as the technology hub of Africa. Of course, Ghana and Tunisia and the rest have to play second fiddle.
Very, very good point to end with. So I really appreciate, and I would want at this point to try to leverage some of the questions from our chat box. Now, one housekeeping thing is that there's an ongoing poll. Please feel free to share your results and share your answers in the ongoing poll. We really, really appreciate that. I mean, there is a question that, did the World Bank pay some of these studies to provide the numbers in countries that you're working on? Can we learn from one another in other countries? And I think this is exactly what is happening at this point in time. Is there any startup that you have seen happening and has been supported by your efforts that has really become quite exemplary? And I think that also boils down to some of the ecosystems that are being supported, and I think the question about policies that have been turned into laws that has already been answered. And I think at this point, let me try to go back to each and every one of you for 1 minute, and I'll just keep this one strict 1 minute. If there is one thing that you would want other countries to learn from your own from today's session, what would it be? Just one line, one statement from each. I'll start with Ali, then go to Eva, Victor, and then wind up with Justice. Ali, over to you.
Yeah, I would echo what Eva said. I mean, each country has its own I would say chemistry in terms of laws. In Tunisia, what worked is a bottom-up approach, because we have a very weak central power since the revolution. We used to be a very autocratic country, and we lost almost all that central power. So the only way out for us is to go through a bottom-up approach. We need to animate a community, and that community need to struggle and hustle and get their voice heard, and make sure the policymaker at the end of the day is listening to that community. That is working or efficient in a country like Tunisia, definitely not in some other countries. So first thing to do is to analyze what is the dynamics within your country and within your ecosystem. Analyze what were the legislative efforts that you consider as flagships of your own country, and benchmark and try to understand how it went, and how things could also be, how things would be done for your own startup act. So I don't think that there is a quite clear replicable model between a country and another.
Thank you very much, Ali. Over to you, Eva.
So I think a lot of interesting things to point out, but if I had one, is just to make sure to be enough inclusive, and not only with the startups and the market sectors and products, service that we could find from the startups, but also as inclusive as possible with the public policymakers themselves and the government, because that's how we allow you to build such a relationship where the dialogue and the co-creation is enough highlighted. And for instance, in Senegal, it's all came up with how can we help those startups, but it ended with a startup act and incentive that were not only applied to the startups to the Startup Act, but incentive that will also apply to all SMEs in regard to the Finance Law 2020, where all the taxation incentive are, of course, open and available for small businesses.
Thank you very much, Eva, for that wonderful note. Victor.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I think I would emphasize is, you know, there's no way we can copy paste any of the laws that are in the different countries. But I think from where I sit as you know, in Kenya is the startup bill has to work and has to make sense for your country or for your economy. So if the Startup Act is not enabling startups to contribute to the socio-economic development of the country, then it's not of no use. You can attract all the investment you want, you can do all the policy gymnastics that you want, but at the end of the day, for us, I think, is success has to translate in significant socio-economic development. Then we can look at awards and the rest of being named Silicon Savannah, etc. But we have to be able to create jobs, sustainable jobs for that matter, and really strengthen our economies.
You should see Silicon is way, way better. Over to you, Justice.
Wow. I'll go for 4 things. Everybody who is advocating for a startup act in his country should focus on, number 1, the core objective, or what we call your core purpose, right? Once you're able to identify that, you are good to go. Now, the second thing have to be contextualization. As Eva said, the inclusiveness, right? We don't want the Startup Act. We don't want the Startup Act to actually be have a political dent on it. Nonetheless, you still have to be inclusive. The policy maker, the end determiner, the destination of the draft. You need to involve them. The startup themselves, the entrepreneurs, the experts themselves. You need to involve them. And then I will go in for sustainability. You know that the Startup Act has no value really if there is no funding support for those who get a startup. Find a sustainable way. What is your source of funding? The Startup Act carries a lot of budget annually. How are you going to raise money? For Tunisians, they have a fund of fund. They have a way of raising their fund. They don't actually depend so much on the government. So sustainability is one key thing I'm looking at. Then the last one have to be with openness, right? I want that utilization of African markets. Your how do you call it? Your act should be able to have a plug for other countries to plug in, for your entrepreneurs to also plug in into other African markets. So core purpose, sustainability, utilization of the African market, and then your inclusiveness, as I put it. All right. I hope I was heard, or I wasn't heard. But I can't hear anything from your end. Oh, it looks like she's gone out. So whilst we waiting for him, okay.
Oh, looks like Gil is off.
Yeah, Gil is off.
Yeah, I think my call had dropped. I'm back now. I
you are
hope
back.
Everyone can.
So I have to repeat myself, or you are okay?
No.
Quickly,
I'm
okay. So
okay
I was talking about a core purpose. So your country should have a core purpose. I was also talking about contextualization. I cannot just lift what Tunisians are doing and bring it to Ghana. You need to contextualize, right? The fact that Tunisians are saying innovative startup is our focus doesn't mean that Ghana should have innovatives. Under the same contextualization, you have to include the stakeholders who matters, your policymakers, your entrepreneurs themselves, your experts, as Eva put it, right? Then I'm also looking at unitizing African market. Your startup act should have an open plug for other countries to plug in, and you to also plug into other African countries, which is very important to me, right? So that openness, that utilization of stuff. And the last one is sustainability. How are you going to fund the investment or the support you're going to give these startups? Is it going to come from the government coffers, as Tunisians have done theirs, fund, or other ones they have, right? As Senegalese have said, they have a guarantee fund. Ghana also have that investment model as well. So these are the 4 things I think every African country should actually focus when they want to advocate for that.
Thank you very much. And I really, really appreciate my very able panel, Ali, Victor, Justice, and Eva. Wonderful to have you today. And thank you very much for sharing, the insights that you had. Now, before I bring in John to wrap up our session, there are, as a moderator, there are a couple of things I'll just like to pull together. So I would say 4 key messages our Tanzanian colleagues should take out of this conversation. One, you have to identify what are you trying to address with this policy that you're proposing to the government. And this is quite key. I mean, if you're going to the ministry, if you're going to talk to parliamentarians, you have to be very, very specific on what you're trying to address. I mean, is it, the financial aspect of things that you're trying to open up the space for enterprises? Are you trying to open up markets? Are you trying to help investors? Are you trying to help entrepreneurs and things like that? So your law, or at least your proposed policy, has to be very specific on that. The second thing is you're supposed to look at
it seems this connection dropped off.
It's gone again. Pray God. Pray God.
Yeah.
Can I make a suggestion to you quickly?
Yeah.
Before the host come, I don't know if you can help me. We African Entrepreneurship Dialogue, we are coming up 2021. We are having a dialogue session for most African entrepreneurial stakeholdership forum. And I would love to have Eva on board. I would love to have all your guests here on board. So I don't know whether you have to maybe create a WhatsApp group so I can share the stuff with them, right? So that we can have further discussion as well.
No worries. I will do that. No worries.
Right.
So looks like Gil is out. I would like to welcome John for the closing remarks, and he has some presentation. And probably by the time he's done, Gil would be back. John, welcome.
Right, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's quite I have to say, it's quite humbling to speak to so many friends, partners from across the country. As usual, Jumane, in 5 minutes, introduced most of what we were going to talk about today. It's an honor to speak after you and in Tanzania, buddy. I'm going to share here in the chat a link to a benchmarking study that we have conducted at i4Policy, and you're going to see that it's linked actually to some of the data that we have here. I invite you to check this out because I think you'll find that it provides quite an important evidence basis when you're going to actually engage in the policymaking process. And in fact, our Eva and my colleague Frida Yausen, who's together with Justice right now in Ghana, of course, is actually bringing a lot of the sort of knowledge base into the lawmaking process from this study that we conducted together. So let's check it out. This is one little excerpt, but I wanted to show this up here because it speaks a bit to Jumane's point in the very beginning about the difference between supporting small businesses and supporting startups. And so what you'll see here, this is a map, a timeline of all of the small business acts that were passed in the African continent since 1980. So Justice, your homies were leading the way back in the 1980s. And then after that, we see a range of policy reforms taking place over the coming years after that. In fact, Tanzania has an SME policy in around 2003, and we actually benchmark that as well in this profile of small business acts and startups. We bring the Tanzanian SME policy as a point of comparison when we look at different policy and legal instruments. So that could be interesting and useful for you guys to reflect on. But what I want to show you is that everyone on this call right now is part of a wave. Whether you realize it or not, you're sitting on top of a gigantic wave that has not even started to crest. So what has happened over the last 30 years is you see this slow buildup of legal reforms to support small business. Since the Tunisian Startup Act 2 years ago, you see 2 more Startup Acts in 2019. And then in 2020, what you see is these laws aren't passed yet, but these are all the lawmaking processes that are in quite advanced stages where you actually have draft laws on the table in the governments. This is Ghana, Kenya, DRC, Benin, Rwanda, as well as Cote d'Ivoire. And then you have a bunch of other countries that are looking at introducing startup policy reforms. So South Africa is talking about it. There's a conversation in Ethiopia about a startup proclamation underneath the presidency. So what I want you to know of is that you are part of something much bigger than yourselves right now. And you have a lot of friends all across the continent that are ready and willing to work with you in this reform. So that's the first major thing that I wanted to show you in reference to this small business support versus startup support. Now, I have to try and bring together so many wise comments from so many friends across the continent and so many amazing community leaders. And I'm going to try and summarize what I feel like are the key takeaways from the conversation. So the first is that governments and startups, governments and entrepreneurs, we want the same thing. So we all want to create jobs, we all want to create local innovation, and we all want to create wealth. I think Ali makes a really interesting point that oftentimes startups are expected to create jobs when they're actually creating markets, but it is the case that startups, by creating markets, create jobs. There are, of course, a lot of startups that we know that are creating jobs through big agency models, through franchising models. But in addition to that, I think we should think about what economists would call the elasticity of job creation of startups. And one of the studies we found in Rwanda was that one new job created in the export sector in Rwanda creates 6 to 7 new jobs in the non-tradable sector in Rwanda. And so whether or not startups are going to be creating the employment to serve the entire population of young people that needs to be employed isn't the question. It's about whether or not startups are going to build the markets that are going to cascade the job creation that we all want to see. And I think we all believe that that's what's going to be happening. And then this point about wealth, I think no startup necessarily wants to pay more taxes, but all startups want to make more money so that they can pay more taxes. And in this, what startups want and what governments want is perfectly aligned. So this is the first key takeaway. The second key takeaway is that entrepreneurs and everybody here on this call today, you are the experts in entrepreneurship. When I talk to governments, and our colleagues talk to governments across the continent, sometimes people in government don't necessarily know what the payroll tax is and how it maybe works in their economy, right? Because maybe they've never paid payroll taxes before. Maybe they don't know what it actually looks like to start a business. And all of you guys do. So in this, startups are really the experts in entrepreneurship. And so I would like to encourage you to know that you need to get involved. So this point that Ali was making, I would suggest actually that it is in fact the fundamental common characteristic across all of the countries on this continent that bottom-up processes will work. In fact, it needs to work. And as my colleague and partner Ava said, inclusivity is really the central point. It's really about making sure that all of the wisdom and knowledge from entrepreneurs can work together with all of the sort of policy-making wisdom from governments to be able to improve the policy-making environment to accelerate entrepreneurship across the continent. So the third main takeaway is that you all need to get involved. And it's really important that you do, because if you're not involved, then the government won't know what they need to do in order to reform and revolutionize the entrepreneurial environment for you. The fourth major takeaway from this conversation today is that you should be using the tools of co-creation that you know. Innovators, entrepreneurs, we're all very much aware of human-centered design, design thinking. Whether we know these tools, intellectually and sort of academically, we know them in practice because we're building solutions that are meant to be solving the needs of our customers. And it's this exact same methodology of building solutions through co-creation that we need to be able, as innovators, to bring to governments to co-create laws together. And the final takeaway that I can leave you with is that you need to not only get involved, but you need to stay involved, and that the process is more important than the outcome. And this goes to the point that my partner Eva was saying earlier, that, you know, the length of the process is massive, you know, like massively different rather, you know, and it sounded like from Ali that it was 2 years in Tunisia with another year of putting in place the, you know, the implementation or the décret d'application. And similarly in Senegal, it was a 19-month process to pass the law. Then you have another, you know, 10 months to pass the implementation degrees at least. In DRC, we're looking at 12 months. In Rwanda, it could be anywhere between 6 to 18 months. We're very much in the sort of drafting phase at the moment. So in every country, it's really going to be different. But I want to share a story of a friend of mine in Nigeria who told me that when they were working on the national data privacy law to pass in 2018, he said that they were settled down. They talked to their team before they started the process. And I welcome you all to meet together and talk as a community in Tanzania about what are you willing to put. And they said that they would be willing to push for 10 years to get the data privacy law passed. So, you know, it could go fast, but prepare for it to go slow so that you're not disappointed. And so that's the final piece of advice, is to get involved and stay involved and to push the process. And then I just want to put up here on the screen this innovation for policy process that my colleague Eva shared earlier, just to be able to kind of map out some of the major steps in the policy reform process. She spoke about that. I'm going to show it here on the screen. And then we also shared in the chat the benchmarking study that we had conducted, which is more of a sort of analysis and, you know, evidence-based for the policy reform. And then we also shared earlier the case study of the Senegalese co-creation process to develop the national law in Senegal. And that talks really about this co-creation process. And just want to point out these 3 major steps. And then within that, you have all of these action steps. And what I want to really emphasize, and this goes back to Jumane's points in the beginning about the human-centered design emphasis on policymaking, is that this process, we really very much stole from human-centered design, design thinking, and we sort of overlaid it on top of a policymaking process to create a framework that we as innovators are familiar with. And so we have these different action steps here. There are 11 different steps, but what I want to tell you is that this is an iterative process. You know, you start off with this sort of empathize, understanding what's going on in the ecosystem, who the main stakeholders are, uniting by building and establishing a really clear common vision for reform that entrepreneurs and innovators share with governments, then defining what are the key challenges, prioritizing those, coming up with ideas around potential solutions, designing them, reviewing them from an analytical perspective, consulting on them. Then you adopt the law, you deliver, and you evaluate. And what I want you to know is, just like design thinking, you go back and forth. Like I said, this could take 6 months, prepare for 10 years, and push to make it go much faster. And I'll leave you here with these key takeaways. So actually, I put up this is the sort of map of the I4Policy movement, which of course many of the people on this call are a part of. If you're not, I invite you to come and check out i4policy.org and join. But I was going to bring up this key takeaways list and share the email for I4Policy at the bottom, so that you can reach out to Eva and I and other members of our team. If you have any questions, if there's anything that we can do, you know, what our belief at the organization is really summed up by this second point, which is that you entrepreneurs are the experts in entrepreneurship. And so all of the work is really about elevating you into policymaking processes. And if there's anything that we can do to support that, we are with you. And I invite you and just really encourage you to keep on pushing together. And I know that if you stick together with amazing leaders like Pregod, like Jumane, like Zahoro, like Jean-Paul Barreto, who an old friend who was on the call earlier, if you guys come together, I'm sure that you will be able to make something happen for Tanzania as well. And just know that we're behind you. We're with you. Good luck. Inshallah. We'll see Allah in Tanzania soon.
Thank you very much, John. Over to you, I pray God. You're on mute.
Thank you, Gil, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening. I think we've had a very fruitful discussion, and we will be making a white paper out of this, and we will share with everyone that has joined and on our social media platforms, so you can have a review even later of what happened today, in case you were late or in case you want to have a deep dive into the discussion. We are a little bit late out of time, so I just want to say thank you again to the panelists for joining us, and to everybody that offered their time to be with us. Until next time, bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.